Night fell heavy over the Louisiana plantation, but inside the grand house, screams echoed against the walls. Shackles clanged as the mistress struggled, her pale hands clawing at the iron that once bound her slaves. But now, it was she who wore the chains. Her voice cracked, begging for mercy, but none came. The firelight flickered across the room as the enslaved man tightened the iron around her throat. What happened that Christmas night of 1847 shocked the South forever. The year was 1847, and the humid swamps of Louisiana whispered with secrets. Spanish moss draped from the cypress trees like tattered curtains, their shadows long across the muddy ground. Among those shadows stood Hawthorne Plantation, a sprawling estate of cotton and cane fields, where the sun beat mercilessly on the backs of the enslaved from dawn until dusk. Here, life was not lived, it was endured. Beneath the relentless gaze of the overseer and the harsh rule of the mistress, every breath, every step, every word was controlled. Among the enslaved was Samuel, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose body bore scars older than his memories. Each mark told the story of the lash, of defiance crushed, of moments where his humanity had been beaten into silence. Samuel had not been born free. He came into the world already bound by the institution of slavery, the son of a woman whose hands worked the cane fields until her skin blistered and bled. His father, he never knew. Some whispered he was a slave, long sold to another state. Others hinted he was the master himself. Samuel stopped asking. Questions were dangerous things on a plantation. By the time Samuel was 12, he had already been put to work, hauling water, carrying firewood, cleaning stalls. His childhood was a blur of sweat and commands, until the day came when he was handed his first hoe and marched to the endless fields under the watch of the overseer, a man named Carver. Carver's whip was his voice, and Samuel quickly learned to obey it. The plantation's master had died years earlier, leaving the estate in the hands of his widow, Mistress Eleanor Hawthorne. To the outside world, she appeared refined, dignified, even charitable at times. She attended church, hosted feasts on Christmas and New Year's, and was known for her fine lace dresses imported from New Orleans. But behind closed doors, Eleanor was cold as iron, her cruelty sharpened by years of bitterness. Without her husband's presence, she ruled with an iron fist, her word law, her punishments legendary. Mistress Eleanor had a fondness for chains. Where other plantation mistresses might have favored whips or confinement, she insisted on shackles. Iron, she once declared before the gathered slaves, is the only language you people understand. Samuel never forgot the sound of her voice that day, or the metallic clink as she ordered iron collars fitted on those who dared resist her. Chains were not just tools of restraint on Hawthorne Plantation. They were symbols. At Christmas feasts, Eleanor would bring them out polished, like trophies, and hang them near the dining hall as if to remind her guests of her control. The same iron that bound her slaves became decorations at her table. For Samuel, each glimpse of those chains was a wound reopened. By his late 20s, Samuel had become one of the strongest workers on the plantation, his body hardened by years of labor. He was often chosen for the heaviest tasks, hauling timber, breaking ground, carrying loads that would buckle another man. This strength drew Eleanor's attention, not as admiration, but as possession. She ordered him to work inside the main house at times, carrying barrels of water or chopping firewood for the grand hearth. It was within those walls Samuel saw her true face. The mistress delighted in humiliation. She would force Samuel to stand silently in the dining hall while she dined with her guests, using him as a display of obedience. Sometimes she ordered him to pour wine, then mocked his hands as clumsy, and struck him across the face when a drop spilled. Other times she would demand he kneel, holding a tray of food at her feet like a dog. But Samuel's suffering extended beyond himself. He watched as children were torn from their mothers, sold away at auction. He saw men whipped until they could no longer stand, their backs flayed open like parchment. He heard the wails of women in the quarters, violated by those who held power over them. Every injustice Samuel witnessed built a fire inside him, one that burned hotter with every passing year. And yet, he endured. for within him lived a memory, a faint, flickering ember of hope passed from his mother before she died. She had whispered to him, "Chains break, masters fall. Never forget." Samuel carried those words like scripture, waiting for the day they might become truth. Life on Hawthorne Plantation moved with a brutal rhythm, marked by seasons of planting and harvest, punctuated by moments of cruelty disguised as order. Christmas was one such moment. For the slaves, it offered no joy, only more labor, slaughtering hogs, preparing feasts, decorating the house for the mistress's celebrations. But for Eleanor, it was her stage. She would gather guests from neighboring plantations, dress in her finest silks, and boast of her wealth and control. On those nights, the slaves were sometimes forced to sing for the guests, their voices trembling with spirituals that masked sorrow. Samuel sang when ordered, his deep voice carrying notes of pain that few noticed. But behind his eyes, something darker stirred. Each Christmas reminded him of the chains, polished and hung like garlands, mocking his people's suffering. By 1847, Samuel was no longer a boy. He was a man hardened by decades of bondage, his hands calloused, his back strong, his will unbroken despite every effort to crush it. He had seen friends buried alive for trying to escape, overseers hanged in retaliation, plantations burned to the ground in whispers of rebellion. These stories traveled from slave to slave, carried like sparks in the wind. And Samuel listened. That year, as Christmas approached, Eleanor's cruelty deepened. Rumors spread that she intended to sell several families to pay debts. Among them was a young woman Samuel cared for deeply, a field slave named Ruth, whose laughter once brought light to the darkness of the quarters. The thought of losing her, of watching another wagon roll away with chained bodies, tore at Samuel's soul. Every chain he had ever worn, every lash he had ever felt, every cry he had ever heard seemed to converge into one boiling truth. He could no longer endure. What Samuel would do next would not just change his life, it would alter the fate of everyone on the plantation. And it would ensure that the mistress who once wielded chains as symbols of her power would come to know them as instruments of her own destruction. But before that night of fire and iron, Samuel's path had to cross a point of no return. And the world of Hawthorne Plantation, so rigid in its cruelty, was about to tremble. The winter of 1847 crept cold across Louisiana, though the chill never reached the quarters where Samuel and the other enslaved men and women lay on hard wooden boards, their breath rising in shallow clouds against the damp air. Hunger gnawed at them, but the greater weight pressing down was fear. For weeks, whispers had spread that Mistress Eleanor intended to sell more slaves after Christmas. Families broken apart like livestock, mothers separated from children, husbands from wives. That fear became flesh when Overseer Carver announced one morning, whip in hand, that Ruth's name was among those marked for the auction block. Ruth, the woman whose laughter once dared to brighten the darkness, whose presence had become Samuel's only fragment of solace. Samuel's heart thundered with rage, though his face remained stone. To show anger was to invite the whip. To show sorrow was to bleed in silence. He swallowed both, burying them deep where the mistress could not see. Mistress Eleanor ruled with a precision that was as cruel as it was deliberate. She enjoyed reminding her slaves of their fragility, their utter lack of control. The week before Christmas, she called the field hands to the big house and forced them to polish the chains that would be displayed at her feast. Samuel's hands trembled as he rubbed the iron links with cloth, their weight heavy with memory. These were the same chains that had bound his mother, the same that had scarred his ankles, the same that Eleanor would boast of before her guests as symbols of discipline and order. "Shine them well," Eleanor hissed as she passed by, her silken dress sweeping the wooden floor. "I want them to gleam like silver in the candlelight. Let my guests see how obedience is won." Samuel kept his eyes lowered, but his mind burned. Every ring of iron felt like a heartbeat, every clink a reminder of what had been stolen from him. The more he polished, the more the thought gnawed at him. These chains would not always belong to the mistress. One day, they might belong to her in a way she could never imagine. Carver, the overseer, made Samuel's days heavier still. A hulking man with a cruel grin, Carver took joy in breaking spirits. He whipped without reason, struck for amusement, and stalked the quarters at night with the stench of whiskey on his breath. For Samuel, Carver was the embodiment of brutality, a man who thrived on pain. More than once, Samuel clenched his fists when Carver lashed another slave across the back, but he held himself in check. Rage was a fire. If it erupted too soon, it would burn only him. But Eleanor was worse, for her cruelty came dressed in civility. She invited Samuel into the house not because she needed him, but because she delighted in seeing his submission up close. One evening, as he poured her wine, she smirked at the tremor in his hand. "Careful, boy," she whispered, her voice low and sharp. "Spill another drop and I'll have you chained to the oak for the night." Her guests laughed lightly, as if cruelty were a game. Samuel said nothing, but his silence was not emptiness. Behind it brewed a storm. The days crawled toward Christmas, each sunrise bringing more dread. The slaves were ordered to slaughter hogs, pluck geese, and haul barrels of cider into the big house for the mistress's feast. Samuel worked with quiet fury, his muscles straining as he lifted crates of fruit and sacks of flour, all for a celebration from which he would be excluded. His back ached, but the greater ache was knowing that Ruth's days on the plantation were numbered. Soon, she would be dragged away in chains, her cries ignored, her body sold to another master. That night, in the quarters, Ruth wept softly. Samuel sat beside her, his large hand resting over hers, his jaw tight. "I won't let them take you," he whispered. She shook her head, tears streaking her face. "You can't stop them. None of us can." But Samuel's eyes told a different story. Deep within them burned a promise Ruth could not yet understand. Meanwhile, Eleanor prepared for her grand Christmas feast. She ordered new candles from New Orleans, polished silver cutlery, and ensured the chains were hung like garlands along the dining room walls. Her cruelty was deliberate theater, each polished shackle, each dangling lock, a silent performance for her wealthy neighbors. She would boast of discipline, of order, of obedience, while the very instruments of suffering gleamed behind her. Samuel noticed it all. He noticed how Eleanor's hands caressed the iron as if it were jewelry. He noticed how she smiled when guests admired her methods. And with each observation, his resolve hardened. The turning of the year was supposed to bring joy to others, but for the enslaved, it brought only uncertainty. January was often the season of sale, when debts were settled by auctioning human lives. Samuel knew Ruth would not survive long under another master's hand, and he knew he could not survive the weight of losing her. Carver's whip cracked more often as Christmas drew near, as though he could sense the growing unrest. One evening, he dragged a young boy into the yard for failing to meet his quota. Before the gathered slaves, Carver lashed him until his back was striped with blood. Eleanor watched from the porch, sipping wine, her eyes glinting cold in the firelight. Samuel's fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He wanted nothing more than to lunge forward, to seize the whip from Carver's hand and drive it across his face. But he knew it was not yet time. Not yet. That night, Samuel lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above him. Every sound of the night, the chirp of crickets, the distant bark of dogs, the rustle of trees, was drowned by the sound of chains in his memory. He remembered his mother's words. Chains break. Masters fall. And in that moment, the fire inside him stopped being a flicker. It became a roaring blaze. He would not wait for freedom to come. He would take it with his own hands, even if it meant blood, even if it meant death. The mistress had spent years reminding her slaves that iron was stronger than flesh. But Samuel now believed otherwise. Flesh could rise, strike, and destroy. Flesh could turn chains into weapons. Flesh could turn fear into fire. The cruelty of Mistress Eleanor and Overseer Carver had forged him into something more than a victim. They had created the very force that would undo them. And when the Christmas feast arrived, Samuel knew it would not end as it had in years before. This year, the feast would end in fire, in chains, in screams that would echo through the Louisiana night. But how would one man rise against a mistress who had enslaved dozens? How could he turn iron against its wielder? The answer was forming in Samuel's mind, piece by piece, like the forging of a weapon. What he would do next would terrify everyone who heard the tale. Christmas Eve arrived draped in cold mist. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat from the mistress's kitchen, yet for the slaves, it carried only dread. Samuel worked from dawn, hauling barrels of cider into the dining hall, where Eleanor's feast would be held. The polished chains hung on the walls like decorations, cold, gleaming reminders of pain disguised as symbols of order. Each clink of iron mocked him. He imagined those chains tightening, not around his wrists, but around Eleanor's pale throat. The thought struck him like lightning. What if the very tools she used to enslave them became the tools of her own undoing? The idea refused to leave his mind. Every clang of iron whispered, "Turn it against her." That afternoon, Samuel stole a moment in the smokehouse, away from Carver's prying eyes. Ruth followed, her face pale with worry. "They're saying I'll be sold the first week of January," she whispered, voice trembling. "There's nothing we can do." But Samuel's eyes blazed. "There is," he said. "I won't let them take you. I won't let her laugh while we suffer." Ruth shook her head fiercely. "If you try anything, they'll hang you." Samuel leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "Better to die striking than live kneeling." For a long moment, Ruth searched his face. Then, without a word, she pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the thunder of his heart. She didn't speak again, but her silence was answer enough. That night, Samuel studied the great house as he carried wood to the hearth. He watched where Eleanor kept her keys, how the chains were arranged, how Carver's whip hung by the door. He noticed the candles lined along the table, the barrels of brandy stacked in the corner, liquid fire waiting to be unleashed. He took it all in, committing every detail to memory. The feast would be the moment. Eleanor would be surrounded by her guests, drunk on power and wine, distracted by laughter. Carver would be boasting of his discipline, and the chains would be gleaming in the candlelight. Samuel's mind sharpened with purpose. He was no longer polishing iron to please his mistress. He was preparing a weapon. On Christmas morning, the slaves were forced to sing carols outside the house. Samuel's voice rumbled deep, carrying notes of sorrow disguised as song. Eleanor smiled at her guests, her rings glittering as she clapped her hands. "Do you hear it?" she said proudly. "Even in chains, they sing." Samuel lowered his gaze, but inside, his rage swelled like a storm tide. Tonight, he thought, her pride would become her downfall. Throughout the day, he moved silently, carrying trays of food, pouring wine, tending to the fire. Every step brought him closer to the moment he had chosen. He noticed where Carver set down his whip, how Eleanor's back turned when she leaned to laugh at her neighbors, how her jeweled hands brushed the polished iron chains like prized ornaments. By twilight, the feast was in full swing. The dining hall glowed with candlelight, the air thick with the smell of roasted goose, pork, and spice. Guests toasted with silver goblets, their laughter mingling with the crackle of the fire. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her voice sharp as she boasted of her control. "These chains," she declared, raising her glass, "are the reason my plantation thrives. Discipline, order, obedience, this is how one rules." Her guests nodded, murmuring their approval. Samuel stood in the shadows, a tray of wine in his hands. His jaw tightened, his knuckles white around the silver. Every word she spoke hammered against his chest. Ruth passed behind him, her eyes flicking briefly to his. She didn't speak, but Samuel felt her silent plea. "Whatever you are planning, be careful." The moment came when Eleanor rose to display her chains more proudly. She gestured toward the wall, where they hung in loops, shining in the candlelight. "Iron does not lie," she said coldly. "It bends the spirit to the will. It reminds them who holds power." Her hand brushed the largest of the chains, heavy links once used to shackle runaways. The room fell silent for a breath, all eyes upon her. And in that silence, Samuel made his choice. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. He set the tray down slowly, silently. His hands flexed, remembering every scar, every lash, every night of grief. He had polished those chains with his own hands. He knew their weight, their sound, their bite. And now, he would teach Eleanor what they truly meant. The thought of Ruth being dragged away, of children screaming as wagons rolled out, of Carver's whip tearing flesh, all of it surged within him. The fire was no longer hidden. It burned through his silence, through his fear, until nothing remained but resolve. He moved closer to the wall, his steps masked by laughter resuming at the table. His hand hovered over the chain, the iron cold against his skin. He gripped it firmly, feeling its weight. Eleanor turned, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of him. "What are you doing there, boy?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Samuel's gaze lifted to meet hers, steady and unflinching. For the first time, he did not lower his eyes. "Learning," he said, his voice low but filled with power. Eleanor blinked, startled by the defiance. The room fell quiet, guests exchanging uneasy glances. Carver began to rise from his seat, hand reaching for his whip. But Samuel did not wait. He stepped forward, the chain heavy in his grasp. The sound of iron dragging across the floor filled the hall like thunder. Gasps erupted. Chairs scraped. Eleanor's face twisted in fury, but before she could speak, Samuel's voice cut through the room. "These chains are not yours." The words hung heavy in the air, a sentence carved in stone. Eleanor's lips parted, but no reply came. For the first time in her reign, her power faltered in the face of something she could not control. A man who refused to bow. Samuel's eyes blazed as he tightened his grip on the chain. He had crossed the threshold, the point of no return. There would be no turning back. And as the firelight flickered across the iron, he knew the night would not end in obedience. It would end in blood, in screams, in the collapse of everything Eleanor had built. The feast would become a reckoning. The dining hall flickered with golden light, shadows dancing across the walls where the chains gleamed. Candles sputtered, their wax dripping like blood down tall brass holders. Laughter had died. A heavy silence hung in the air as Samuel stood before them, the iron links dragging at his side like a serpent waiting to strike. Mistress Eleanor's jeweled fingers clutched the edge of the table. Her pale face stiffened, her lips curling into a sneer. "Put that down," she hissed, her voice cold, commanding. "Do you forget who you are?" Samuel's chest rose and fell with steady breath. His voice was deep, unshaken. "I remember exactly who I am, and I remember everything you've done." The words cracked across the room like a whip. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats, their hands frozen around goblets of wine. Carver, the overseer, snarled as he shoved back his chair. His heavy boots pounded the floor as he reached for the whip at his side. But Samuel moved first. With one swift motion, he swung the chain, the iron links whistling through the air before striking Carver's wrist. The crack of bone echoed. Carver cried out, the whip falling from his grasp. Samuel's eyes blazed as he advanced, every step radiating decades of pain turned to fury. Carver staggered back, clutching his shattered wrist, but Samuel was relentless. The chain lashed out again, striking Carver across the face, splitting his cheek open in a spray of blood. The overseer fell to his knees, groaning, his cruel grin gone forever. Gasps erupted around the table. A woman screamed. One man pushed back his chair, stumbling for the door, but froze under Samuel's glare. The room was his now. Samuel turned toward Eleanor. She had risen from her chair, her silken gown shimmering in the firelight, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. "How dare you?" she began, but her words were cut short as Samuel slammed the chain onto the table, the iron links scattering goblets and plates. Wine spilled like blood across the linen. "I dare," Samuel growled. His voice shook the walls. "Tonight, you learn what chains truly mean." Eleanor's eyes darted to her guests, seeking strength in their presence, but none moved to help her. Fear rooted them in place, their faces pale as ghosts. Samuel moved around the table, his boots striking hard against the wooden floor. The chain dragged behind him, scraping, ringing, like a funeral bell tolling for the mistress. Eleanor backed away, her jeweled necklace trembling against her throat. "You forget yourself," she spat, her voice cracking. "You are nothing but a slave. Not tonight." Samuel lunged forward, the chain snapping out like lightning. In an instant, it coiled around her wrist, yanking her forward with a cry. She stumbled, striking the table as goblets toppled, their contents spilling onto the floor. The guests leapt from their chairs, but none dared intervene. The power Eleanor had flaunted for decades crumbled before their eyes. Samuel's grip was unyielding. He twisted the chain around her arm, pulling her close. She fought, nails clawing at his skin, but his strength was immovable. Her voice rose into a shriek. "Let me go! Guards! Someone stop him!" But the guards had long since fled, or perhaps they too feared the storm in Samuel's eyes. With one heave, Samuel dragged her across the floor, past the fallen carver, past the scattered feast. The chains clattered behind them as he hauled her toward the wall where her trophies gleamed. The very chains she had forced others to polish now awaited her. The slaves who had been forced to serve stood in the corners, their eyes wide with disbelief and awe. For the first time, they saw a master brought low. For the first time, the iron was not their prison but their weapon. Eleanor screamed as Samuel slammed her back against the wall. The polished chains rattled as he seized one and looped it around her neck. She thrashed, her silk gown tearing, her jewels scattering to the floor like worthless stones. "Please," she gasped, her voice strangled. "Samuel, mercy!" Her plea echoed cruelly, for mercy was a word she had never spoken when others begged at her feet. Samuel's jaw tightened. He leaned close, his voice a growl. "Did my mother beg you for mercy when you chained her? Did Ruth? Did the children you sold? Did you ever hear their cries?" Eleanor's eyes widened, but no words came. The chain tightened with Samuel's pull, cutting her voice into a wheeze. Her face flushed red, then purple, her hands clawing at the iron. The hall filled with chaos. Guests screamed, some fleeing into the night, others frozen in horror. The fire roared louder, the shadows deeper, as if the house itself bore witness to her reckoning. Carver, bloodied and broken, tried to crawl toward the whip he had dropped, but Samuel kicked it aside. "Your lash won't save her now," he thundered. The chain strained, links groaning as Eleanor's body fought in vain. Her heels scraped the floor, her eyes bulged, her cries turned to choking silence. Samuel's muscles burned, but he did not relent. The image of Ruth in chains, of children screaming, of bodies whipped raw, every memory fueled his grip. At last, Eleanor's struggle slowed. Her jeweled hand slipped from the chain, dangling limp. Her eyes rolled back, and with a final rattling gasp, her body went still. The mistress who had once ruled with iron had been hanged by her own chains. For a moment, silence consumed the hall. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant shouts of terrified guests fleeing into the night. Samuel stood over Eleanor's body, his chest heaving, sweat and blood streaking his skin. Then, slowly, he let the chain fall from his hands. The iron clattered against the floor, echoing like a final verdict. The slaves in the corners stared, their eyes wide with awe. For years, they had been forced to bow, to kneel, to obey. Now, before them lay proof that even the cruelest mistress could fall. But Samuel was not finished. His gaze fell on Carver, who still crawled across the floor, blood dripping from his broken face. The overseer's eyes widened in terror as Samuel approached, the heavy chain dragging once more. "No, please," Carver wheezed, raising his unbroken hand. "Spare me." Samuel's jaw tightened. He raised the chain high, and with one swift motion, brought it crashing down across Carver's skull. The overseer collapsed, lifeless, blood pooling across the wooden floor. The house trembled with silence. Samuel stood among the ruins of Mistress and overseer, the chain heavy in his hand, his chest rising with every breath of freedom he had seized. Behind him, Ruth stepped forward, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She looked at Eleanor's body, then at Samuel. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ruth whispered, "It's done." But Samuel shook his head slowly. No, it's only begun. Because outside those walls, the plantation still stood. Fields still stretched endless. Cabins still held men and women bound in fear. And though Eleanor's reign had ended, others would come unless he carried this fire beyond. Samuel turned to the slaves who had watched in silence. His voice thundered. You are no longer theirs. Tonight, we are free, or we die fighting for it. Their eyes filled with a light long extinguished. One by one, they nodded, some clutching knives stolen from the table, others raising fists hardened by labor. The spark had leapt from Samuel into their hearts. The fire had begun, and it would not be contained. The air outside was thick with smoke. The once proud plantation house groaned as fire chewed through its bones, flames licking at the rafters, casting a red glow across the fields. The screams of guests still fleeing echoed into the night, blending with the crackle of burning timber. Samuel stepped out into the yard, the heavy chain dragging behind him like a shadow that refused to leave. His body was battered, his arms streaked with blood, but his stride was steady. Behind him came Ruth, clutching the hand of a small boy who had hidden in the kitchens, his eyes wide with wonder and terror. More followed, men and women who had once bowed under Eleanor's lash, now stumbling into the open air, tasting freedom for the first time. For a moment, they stood together beneath the night sky. The stars glittered cold and distant, but the fire's glow lit their faces with something brighter than flame, defiance. Where do we go? Ruth asked, her voice trembling. Samuel lifted his gaze beyond the fields, toward the dark woods that stretched for miles. We run. Tonight, the chains break. A murmur rippled through the group. Fear gnawed at their hearts. They knew hounds would be sent, patrols would come. But fear no longer held them like it once did. Fear had burned with the mistress in her hall. They moved as one, crossing the fields where they had bent their backs for years. The soil beneath their feet, once stained with sweat and blood, now carried the rhythm of their march. Every step was rebellion. Every breath was stolen freedom. Behind them, the plantation blazed higher, the smoke rising like a funeral pyre to the heavens. For those still bound across the south, it was a signal, faint, distant, but real. Somewhere, someone had dared to strike back. But freedom is never without cost. By dawn, the overseer's allies had rallied. Riders swept through the countryside, dogs at their heels, hunting the fugitives. Shots cracked in the distance, and more than once the runaways were forced to scatter through thickets and streams to throw the hounds off their scent. Some were caught, dragged back in chains. Their cries echoed in the woods, but Samuel pressed on, Ruth and the boy at his side. We can't stop, he whispered. Not now. Not when we've come this far. Exhaustion clawed at their bodies. Hunger gnawed. Yet the fire of what they had seen, Eleanor's downfall, Carver's death, burned hotter than their pain. It carried them forward. Days turned into nights, nights into days. They slept in hollow trees, drank from muddy streams, whispered prayers into the dark. Some spoke of the north, of rivers that led to freedom. Others dreamed only of survival. But for Samuel, the path was clear. He had not only broken his own chains, he had shattered the illusion of his master's power. Even if he fell, even if the woods swallowed him forever, his act had carved a scar into the world that could not be erased. Weeks later, whispers spread across the South. Whispers of a slave who had turned the chains against his mistress, of a plantation house set aflame during a feast, of a master hanged by her own iron. Some dismissed it as rumor too wild to be believed. Others hushed the talk, fearing it would spark rebellion. But among the enslaved, the story spread like wildfire. Around campfires, in whispered hymns, in the hush of moonlit cabins, they spoke the name Samuel. Some said he had been captured and hanged. Others swore he still roamed free, leading others north, torch in hand. Truth became legend, legend became hope. And in that hope, chains began to feel lighter. Masters grew uneasy, glancing over their shoulders at night, wondering if the quiet man in the fields might one day stand over them with iron in his hands. For Ruth, the boy, and a handful of others, the journey ended far to the north. They found sanctuary in the arms of strangers who risked everything to shield them. They built new lives, carrying scars, but also carrying the memory of the night when one man rose and said no more. As for Samuel, his fate was never written clearly. Some claimed he died in the swamps, cut down by patrolmen. Others believed he made it all the way to freedom, vanishing into a world where he could no longer be hunted. But perhaps the truth matters less than the story. For stories outlive flesh and bone. And so we end where we began, in chains. But this time, the chains no longer bind. They hang as a symbol, cold iron twisted into memory. They remind us that power can be turned against its wielder, that even in the darkest night, there is a spark waiting to catch. Samuel's story is not just about vengeance. It is about transformation, of fear into fury, of pain into strength, of silence into a voice that echoes through generations. When you hear the rattle of chains in history's halls, remember his name. Remember the fire that consumed the mistress's house, the cries that turned to silence, the slaves who ran beneath the stars. And remember this: freedom is never given. It is taken, taken in blood, taken in fire, taken in the unyielding grip of a man who once bowed his head, but rose to break the world that tried to break him.